Have you ever imagined what it's like to grow up hating someone you've never even met? This is the story of Isabela Montoya and Diego Herrera, two young people whose love defied decades of family hatred and forever changed the fate of two powerful families. It all began in 1995, in the prosperous city of Valencia, Spain. The Montoyas and the Herreras had been two of the most influential families in the region for generations. Both were in the wine business, with vineyards stretching for miles across the Golden Hills. But what was once a prosperous partnership became the bitterest rivalry the city had ever known. Eduardo Montoya and Ricardo Herrera had been more than business partners, they had been like brothers. Together, they built a wine empire that seemed destined to last forever. But in 1975, a dispute over the rights to an exceptional harvest irreparably tore them apart. Eduardo accused Ricardo of stealing trade secrets and sabotaging their best wines. Ricardo, in turn, claimed Eduardo had forged documents to take the most fertile lands. The legal battle lasted 3 years. The lawyers got rich while both families were emotionally and financially drained. When it finally ended, both had lost more than they had gained. The Montoyas kept the northern lands, the Herreras the southern ones. But the cost was far greater than money. They lost their friendship, their trust, and were left with a hatred that would be passed down to their children like a cursed inheritance. From that moment on, the rules were clear in both families. The Montoyas were never to speak to the Herreras, and vice versa. The children grew up hearing stories about how wicked the others were, how they had betrayed their family and ruined their lives. At school, the children of both families sat on opposite sides of the classroom. At church, they occupied separate pews. At town festivals, they didn't even glance at each other. Isabela Montoya was born in 1980, in the midst of this silent war. Since she was a child, her father Eduardo had taught her that the Herreras were her natural enemies. "Never trust a Herrera," he told her every night before bed. "They took everything that was rightfully ours. They are liars, traitors, and thieves." Isabela absorbed these words as if they were absolute truths, never questioning them. Diego Herrera, born just a year after Isabela, received the same indoctrination from the opposite side. His father Ricardo told him how the Montoyas had destroyed their family with lies and manipulation. "The Montoyas think they're better than us," he explained as they walked through the vineyards. "But the truth is they're arrogant and ruthless. They'd do anything to see us fail." The two young people grew up in parallel worlds, separated by only a few kilometers but divided by an abyss of inherited hatred. Isabela became a bright and passionate young woman, studying oenology in university with the dream of bringing Montoya wines to international fame. Diego, equally talented, specialized in innovative cultivation techniques, determined to prove that the Herreras could produce the best wines in all of Spain. But fate, as it often does, had other plans for them. In 1998, when Isabela was 18 and Diego 19, their paths were about to cross in a way that would change not only their lives, but the future of both families forever. On September 15, 1998, Valencia celebrated its annual wine festival. It was the most important event of the year, where all the region's wineries showcased their best harvests. For the first time in decades, both the Montoyas and the Herreras decided to participate, each determined to prove their superiority over the other. Isabela had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She had personally selected the bottles that would represent her family, studied every tasting note, and rehearsed her presentation to perfection. She wore an elegant navy blue dress that brought out her green eyes, and her chestnut hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders. She was nervous but excited. This would be her first official appearance representing the Montoyas. Diego had arrived early at the festival. He wore a dark gray suit that matched his eyes, and his black hair was perfectly slicked back. He brought with him a selection of wines that represented years of innovation and experimentation in the Herrera vineyards. This was his opportunity to prove that the new generation could surpass the achievements of their parents. The festival took place in the city's main square, surrounded by colorful stands and filled with the intoxicating aroma of wine. The two families had set up their booths at opposite ends of the square, as if separated by an invisible line. The people of Valencia moved carefully between the two booths, fully aware of the tension in the air. Isabella was explaining the characteristics of a Reserva Tempranillo when she noticed someone watching her intensely from across the plaza. When she looked up, her eyes met those of a young man whose expression she couldn't decipher. For a moment, time seemed to stop. There was something in that gaze that disturbed and attracted her at the same time. Diego had been discreetly watching the Montoya booth all morning, more out of curiosity than espionage. He had heard so much about the rival family that he felt a strange fascination to see them for himself. But when he saw Isabella, his interest shifted into something entirely different. He had never seen anyone so beautiful and elegant, and the way she spoke about wine with such passion and knowledge completely captivated him. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Diego began to walk toward the Montoya stand. His steps were hesitant, as if a part of him tried to stop him, but something stronger pushed him forward. Isabella saw him approaching and felt her heart race. She knew she should turn away, but she couldn't take her eyes off this mysterious young man. "Excuse me," Diego said when he finally reached the stand, his voice slightly trembling. "Could you tell me about this wine? It looks exceptional." He pointed to a bottle of Garnacha that Isabella had just been describing. Isabella hesitated for a moment. There was something familiar about the young man's face, but she couldn't place it. "Of course," she finally replied, her voice professional but warm. "This is one of our most special wines. It comes from vines that are over 50 years old." As Isabella spoke, Diego lost himself in the sound of her voice. It had a musical tone that both soothed and excited him. He asked insightful questions about the winemaking process, the soil characteristics, and aging techniques. Isabella was surprised by how much this stranger knew about wine, and soon found herself talking to him as if he were an old friend. "Do you also work in the wine business?" Isabella asked, genuinely curious. Diego felt a knot in his stomach. "Yes, my family owns vineyards here in the region," he answered carefully, avoiding the name Herrera. "How wonderful! That must be exciting. I grew up among the vines, and I can't imagine doing anything else." Isabella smiled, and Diego felt his heart skip a beat. They talked for almost an hour, lost in a conversation that flowed so naturally that they both completely forgot where they were. Isabella discovered that this mysterious young man not only understood wine, but had innovative ideas about sustainable farming and fermentation techniques that fascinated her. Diego, for his part, was amazed by Isabella's intelligence and passion, and by how her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. But all good things must come to an end. Eduardo Montoya, who had been busy with other visitors, finally noticed his daughter talking to a young stranger. When he came closer to investigate, he immediately recognized the familiar features of the boy's face. "Isabella!" Eduardo shouted, his voice filled with horror and fury. "Step away from him immediately." Isabella was startled, confused by her father's reaction. "Papa, we were just talking about wines." "That's Diego Herrera." Eduardo practically spat the name. "The son of our worst enemy." Isabella's world shook. The young man she had been talking to so comfortably, with whom she had felt such a natural connection, was the enemy she had been trained to hate since childhood. She looked at Diego with eyes full of shock and something that felt like betrayal. Diego felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. The beautiful young woman who had captured his heart in an hour was Isabella Montoya, the daughter of the family that had destroyed his own. Everything he had felt, the connection he had experienced, now seemed like a cruel joke of fate. I didn't know," Diego stammered, but Eduardo was already dragging Isabella away from him. "Never come near my daughter again," Eduardo shouted at Diego. "The Herreras have already done us enough harm." As Isabella was pulled away, she turned to look at Diego one last time. Their eyes met for a moment, and in that glance there was pain, confusion, and something deeper neither of them dared to name. The days following the festival were torture for both young lovers. Isabella found herself unable to concentrate on her studies or vineyard work. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Diego's face, remembered the warmth of his smile and the intensity of his gaze. But whenever those thoughts overwhelmed her, her father's voice echoed in her mind. The Herreras are our enemies. What's happening to me? Isabella asked herself as she walked alone through the familiar vines. I'm supposed to hate him. Papa has told me my whole life how evil the Herreras are. But when I spoke with Diego, I didn't see evil. I saw intelligence, passion, kindness. Isabella tried to convince herself that she had been fooled, that Diego had been pretending or manipulating her somehow. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that the connection she had felt with him was real. There was something in his eyes that told her he had experienced the same thing. Diego, for his part, wasn't doing any better. He had returned to the Herrera vineyards in a state of complete confusion. His father Ricardo quickly noticed something was wrong. What's bothering you, son? Ricardo asked as they inspected the vines together. You've been distracted since the festival. Diego hesitated. Part of him wanted to tell his father everything, but he knew exactly how Ricardo would react. Nothing, Dad. I'm just thinking about new techniques to improve the harvest. Ricardo studied him carefully. Diego, I've known you since you were born. Something's troubling you. Did something happen at the festival? No, Dad. Everything's fine. Diego walked off quickly, but Ricardo continued watching him with concern. That night, Diego lay awake staring at the ceiling. How is it possible that I feel this way about a Montoya? He asked himself. My whole life I've been taught they're our enemies. But Isabella, she was different. She was intelligent, passionate, beautiful. She spoke about wine like it was poetry. In the weeks that followed, both tried to resume their normal lives, but it was impossible. Isabella began inventing excuses to go into town, secretly hoping to run into Diego. Diego, on his part, started visiting the local library, knowing that Isabella often went there to study. 3 weeks after the festival, fate brought them together again. Isabella was at the local bookstore, looking for a book on French winemaking techniques, when she felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned around, and there he was, holding the same book in his hands. Isabella, Diego said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Diego, she replied, her heart racing once more. They stood there, motionless in the middle of the bookstore, unsure of what to say. Finally, Diego spoke. Could we talk? Just for a few minutes. Isabella knew she should say no. She knew that talking to Diego was a betrayal of her family, a breaking of every rule that had governed her life. But she also knew she couldn't keep living with all these unanswered questions. All right, she whispered. Just for a few minutes. They left the bookstore and walked in silence to a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from curious eyes. Once seated, neither of them knew how to begin. Isabella, I want you to know I didn't know who you were when we talked at the festival, Diego said at last. I know, Isabella replied. I didn't know who you were either. But that doesn't change what our families have lived. But does it have to change what we could live? Diego asked, his voice filled with hope and desperation. Isabella felt her defenses crumble. I don't know, Diego. All my life, I've been told that the Herreras are evil, that they betrayed and robbed us. But when I talk to you, I don't see an enemy. I see someone who shares my passion for wine, who understands my dreams. I feel the same way, Diego admitted. My parents told me terrible things about the Montoyas. But you're nothing like what they said. You're smart, kind, passionate. When we spoke at the festival, I felt like I'd found someone who truly understood me. They looked into each other's eyes, and in that moment, something between them changed irreversibly. They were no longer just Isabella Montoya and Diego Herrera, heirs to an old feud. They were two young people who had found something beautiful in the middle of hatred. What are we going to do? Isabella asked, her voice barely a whisper. Diego gently took her hand. I don't know. But I do know I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel for you. I know it's complicated, I know our families would never understand, but we can't change our feelings, Isabella finished. Exactly. They sat there, holding hands, knowing they had crossed a line they could never return from. They had admitted their feelings were stronger than their inherited hatred, but they still didn't know what to do with that truth. I'm scared, Isabella admitted. So am I, Diego said. But I'm more scared of never seeing you again. Maybe we could meet here from time to time. Just to talk. Just to get to know each other better. Diego nodded. Yes, we could do that. But we have to be careful. If our families find out. They won't, Isabella said, with more determination than she felt. We'll be careful. And so, in that little cafe far from the world, Isabella and Diego made a decision that would change everything. They decided to give what they felt a chance, no matter the consequences. They didn't know that this decision would lead them down a path full of secrets, lies, and eventually, a truth that would be impossible to hide. Over the following months, Isabella and Diego developed an elaborate system of secret meetings. They met at the small cafe on the outskirts of town every Wednesday afternoon, when Isabella was supposedly studying at the library, and Diego claimed to be inspecting vineyards in the southern region. They also met on Sunday mornings at an old abandoned mill Diego had discovered in the hills separating the two families' properties. These meetings became the most cherished moments of their lives. They talked for hours about their dreams, their passions, their fears. Isabella told Diego about her plans to study in France, about her desire to create wines that combined tradition and innovation. Diego shared his experiments with organic cultivation techniques, his ideas on sustainability, and his dream of creating a wine that could rival the best in the world. You know what's the most ironic? Isabella said one Sunday morning as they sat in the mill sharing grapes from her family's vineyard. Our families have spent decades competing to make the best wine in the region, but if we combined our knowledge, we could create something truly extraordinary. Diego smiled, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're right. Your fermentation ideas and my cultivation methods, we could revolutionize winemaking in Spain. It's a shame it's impossible, Isabella sighed, resting her head on Diego's chest. Why does it have to be impossible? Diego asked, his voice full of hope. Maybe one day our families will be able to move past the hatred. Isabella looked up at him. Do you really think that could happen? I have to believe it, he replied, kissing her forehead. Because the alternative is unthinkable. As their love grew, they became more skilled at keeping their secret. Isabella made increasingly elaborate excuses to explain her absences. She told her father she was taking extra French classes, joining a book club, or volunteering at the local library. Eduardo, proud of his daughter's dedication, never questioned her stories. Diego, for his part, became a master of cover stories. He told his father he was scouting new land for potential expansion, visiting other vineyards to learn new techniques, or meeting with equipment suppliers. Ricardo, impressed by his son's initiative, encouraged him to keep being proactive. But maintaining a secret love was emotionally exhausting. Isabella began suffering from insomnia, and Diego developed constant headaches from the stress. The guilt ate away at them, but they couldn't resist the pull they felt toward each other. Sometimes I feel like I'm living a double life, Isabella confessed one afternoon at the cafe. At home, I'm the obedient daughter who hates the Herreras. But with you, I feel like myself. It's confusing and painful. Diego held her hands tightly. I feel the same. But these moments with you are the only times I feel truly happy. When I'm at home, listening to my father speak of how terrible the Montoyas are, I feel like I'm betraying what I know to be true, that you're the most wonderful person I've ever known. Their meetings grew more intimate over time. They took long walks through the hills, shared meals they prepared together, read each other poems and passages from books they loved. Diego taught Isabella about wild grape varieties growing in the hills, and she taught him tasting techniques she'd learned from French masters. One day, Isabella arrived at the mill with something special. I have a surprise for you, she told Diego with a mysterious smile. What is it? Diego asked, intrigued. She pulled a homemade wine bottle from her bag. I made it in secret, using grapes from both our vineyards and a technique I learned from a French book. I wanted to share it with you." Diego was amazed. "Isabella, this is incredible. When did you find time to do this?" "At night, when everyone's asleep. I use the small cellar under the main house. No one ever goes there." They opened the bottle and tasted the wine together. It was exquisite, with a complex flavor that combined Spanish tradition and French innovation. "This is extraordinary," Diego said, savoring the wine. "You have a natural talent. This could rival anything produced by our vineyards." Isabella blushed. "Do you really think so?" "Absolutely. You're brilliant, Isabella. You're going to do amazing things." In that moment, sitting together in the abandoned mill, sharing the wine Isabella had created with her own hands, they felt their love deepen to a new level. They weren't just two young people who had met by chance, they were soulmates, united by a profound passion for wine and for life. "I love you," Diego said suddenly, the words escaping his lips before he could stop them. Isabella's heart stopped. She had been waiting to hear those words for weeks, but now that she had, she also felt the weight they carried. "I love you too," she replied, her voice full of emotion and fear. They kissed for the first time, a kiss full of passion, love, and the desperation of two people who knew their love was forbidden. In that moment, the outside world disappeared. There were no Montoyas or Herreras, no hatred or vengeance. There were only Isabella and Diego, two young souls madly in love. But the outside world hadn't truly disappeared. And soon, their secret love would be tested in ways they never could have imagined. The autumn of 1999 brought with it changes that would test Isabella and Diego's ability to keep their love hidden. They had been seeing each other for over a year, and their relationship had deepened into something neither of them could live without. But as their bond grew stronger, so did the difficulty of hiding it. Isabella had begun changing in ways she couldn't control. Her mother, Carmen Montoya, was the first to notice. "Isabella, you've been very distracted lately," she said one morning during breakfast. "And you have a light in your eyes I haven't seen before. Is something special happening in your life?" Isabella's heart raced. "No, Mama. I'm just excited about my studies. I've been learning so much about advanced winemaking techniques." Carmen studied her carefully. "Are you sure that's all? You've been singing while working in the vineyards, and yesterday I saw you smiling to yourself for no reason. Those are signs of..." "Signs of what?" Isabella asked, trying to sound casual. "Of a young woman in love." Isabella nearly choked on her coffee. "Mama, don't be ridiculous. There's no one in my life. You know I'm focused on my future." But Carmen was not easily fooled. She had raised 3 daughters and knew the signs of young love. "Isabella, if there's someone special, you can tell me. I know your father can be protective, but I understand that young women need love and companionship." Isabella was tempted to tell her mother everything. Carmen had always been more understanding, less rigid than Eduardo. But she knew, even Carmen would never accept that she was in love with a Herrera. "Mama, I promise, if there ever is someone, you'll be the first to know," Isabella lied. "But right now, it's just my studies." Meanwhile, Diego faced his own challenges. His younger sister, Sofia, had started asking uncomfortable questions. "Diego, why are you always so happy on Wednesday afternoons?" she asked one night during dinner. "And why do you leave so early on Sunday mornings? Where do you go?" "I just like exploring the hills," Diego replied, trying to sound relaxed. "It's peaceful." "Alone?" Sofia pushed. "Because last Sunday, I saw you talking to someone near the old mill. I think it was a girl." Diego froze. "You must have been seeing things, Sofia. I was alone." "No, I'm sure. She had brown hair and was wearing a blue dress." Ricardo, who had been listening, looked up from his plate. "Who were you talking to, Diego?" "No one, Dad. Sofia probably just saw a shadow or something." But Ricardo didn't look convinced. "Diego, I hope you're not hiding anything. You know you can trust me. I know, Dad. I'm not hiding anything. That night, Diego couldn't sleep. He and Isabella were walking on increasingly thin ice. If Sofia had spotted them, others could too. He decided he needed to talk to Isabella about being more careful. Things worsened when Eduardo Montoya began noticing changes in his daughter's behavior. Isabella had been arriving late to family dinners, was distracted during business meetings, and, most alarming of all, had started defending views that were unusual for her. During one family dinner, the conversation turned, as it often did, to the Herreras. Eduardo was complaining that they had expanded their vineyards eastward, too close to Montoya land. The Herreras don't respect boundaries, Eduardo grumbled. They're always trying to take what isn't theirs. Isabella, without thinking, replied, Papa, maybe they're just trying to grow their business. That doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to hurt us. The silence that followed was deafening. Eduardo stared at his daughter in disbelief. Isabella, did you just defend the Herreras? She realized her mistake immediately. No, Papa. I was just thinking out loud. Thinking out loud? Eduardo turned red. Isabella, the Herreras destroyed our family. They stole years of my life with their lies and betrayal. How can you even suggest giving them the benefit of the doubt? Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. I'm sorry, Papa. I didn't mean it like that. Carmen stepped in quickly. Eduardo, calm down. Isabella is young and learning to form her own opinions. That doesn't mean she's betraying the family. But Eduardo wasn't convinced. Isabella, remember this, the Herreras are not our neighbors or friendly rivals. They are our enemies. And enemies deserve neither sympathy nor forgiveness. That night, Isabella cried silently in her room. Every lie, every moment she had to pretend to hate when all she felt was love, was tearing her apart. She wondered how much longer they could keep this up. Diego was facing a similar struggle. His father had started assigning him more responsibilities in the vineyard business, leaving him with less time to see Isabella. Worse still, Ricardo had begun talking more frequently about finding a suitable wife for Diego. You're 20 now, Ricardo said one morning while reviewing accounting books. It's time you thought about settling down. I know several respectable families with daughters your age. Diego felt sick. Dad, I'm not ready for marriage. I want to focus on the business. Business is important, but so is continuing the family line. You need a wife who understands our values, who knows what it means to be a Herrera. And what does it mean to be a Herrera? Diego asked, genuinely curious. It means loyalty, honor, never forgetting who our enemies are, Ricardo replied firmly. It means finding someone who shares our hatred for the Montoyas. Diego felt his world crumble. How could he marry someone who hated the person he loved most? How could he build a life based on hatred, now that he had discovered the beauty of love? The pressure from both families was mounting, and Isabella and Diego knew they had to make a choice. They couldn't live this double life forever. But neither was ready to face the consequences of revealing their love. At their next Wednesday meeting, both were visibly anxious. Diego, I don't know how much longer I can do this, Isabella said, tears rolling down her cheeks. Every day it gets harder to lie to my family. My father is starting to suspect something. I know, Diego replied, holding her tightly. My father's starting to ask questions too. And he's talking about finding me a wife. Isabella pulled away to look at him. A wife. Yes, but Isabella, you have to know there's no one else for me. Only you. Always you. But what are we going to do? We can't go on like this. And we can't be together, openly. Diego took her hands in his. What if we ran away? What? What if we left Valencia? We could go to France, or Italy. Start a new life together, away from our families and all this madness. Isabella felt a mix of hope and fear. Would you really give up everything for me? I'd be giving up nothing if I had you, Diego replied. I'd be gaining everything. Isabella stayed silent for a long time, weighing the decision. Finally she said, Diego, I love the idea of being with you without hiding, without lying, without pretending. But I also love my family, despite everything. Could you really live knowing you'd never see your father or your sister again? Diego felt the weight of it all. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know I can't live without you. I need time to think, Isabella said. It's a huge decision. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Isabella, whatever we decide, we have to decide soon. The suspicions are growing, and if they find out... I know, she whispered. I know. They said goodbye that afternoon, aware that they had reached a turning point. Their secret love couldn't remain secret much longer. Soon, they would have to choose, between love and family, happiness and loyalty, a future together and a past that had shaped them. What they didn't know was that destiny was already in motion, and very soon, the decision would be taken out of their hands. The revelation had fallen like a bomb on both families. Elena and Mateo found themselves at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything they had secretly built over the past months. The Mendoza and Vasquez families, who had been at odds for generations over a feud that no one fully remembered anymore, now had to deal with a truth that challenged their entire belief system. The Mendoza household was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Don Fernando paced back and forth in his study, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. His daughter, his princess, had dared to betray everything their name stood for. Dona Carmen wept silently, holding in her trembling hands a photograph of Elena she had found in her husband's coat pocket, a photo he had taken in secret during one of Elena and Mateo's clandestine meetings. Elena's brothers were divided. Some supported their father's decision to forbid any contact with the Vasquez family, while others began to question whether it was truly worth maintaining a feud that had brought so much pain over the years. Meanwhile, tensions ran just as high at the Vasquez household. Don Ricardo had called an emergency family meeting, gathering the entire clan to decide what to do about Mateo. The betrayal cut deeper because Mateo was considered the natural heir to the family leadership, the one who was supposed to uphold honor and tradition above all. His mother, Dona Isabel, oscillated between maternal understanding and bursts of bitter disappointment. How could you do this to us? She shouted again and again, while uncles and cousins looked at Mateo with a mix of disdain and pity. Mateo tried to explain that love knows no family boundaries, that Elena was an extraordinary woman who saw beyond prejudice, but his words fell on deaf ears. The family pressure was suffocating, and he began to doubt whether he could truly fight an entire legacy of hatred for the love of one woman, no matter how deeply he loved her. Elena, on her part, was practically a prisoner in her own home. Her father had issued strict orders that she not leave the house without supervision, assigning 2 of her older brothers to keep a constant eye on her. Every attempt to reach out to Mateo was intercepted, every tear was seen as a sign of weakness, confirming to them that she had been manipulated by the enemy. Her childhood friends, swayed by their own families, began to distance themselves from her, whispering behind her back about the shame she had brought upon her family name. But Elena wasn't willing to give up so easily. During long sleepless nights, she planned ways to see Mateo again, to let him know that her love remained intact despite the storm raging around them. She wrote letters she could never send, rehearsed speeches she would never get to deliver, and dreamed of a future that seemed more impossible each day. Yet deep in her heart, a small flame of hope still burned, fueled by the certainty that what she felt for Mateo was real and worth any sacrifice. The situation became even more complicated as rumors began to spread throughout the city. The secret that Elena and Mateo had carefully guarded for months was now public knowledge, and each version of the story was more dramatic than the last. Some claimed they had planned to run away together, others said they had been caught in a compromising situation, and the most imaginative insisted it was a scheme to merge the 2 families and split their fortunes. Public opinion added another layer of pressure to the already overwhelming family tension, creating a toxic environment that threatened not only their relationship but also their mental and emotional health. The businesses of both families began to suffer, as employees and business partners were forced to take sides, further deepening a divide that now stretched far beyond the household walls. It was clear the situation had reached a point of no return, and whatever decisions they made from that moment on would have irreversible consequences for everyone involved. The pressure intensified when both families decided to take drastic measures to permanently separate Elena and Mateo. The Mendozas announced that Elena would be sent to live with a distant aunt in Spain, while the Vasquez family planned to send Mateo to manage a branch of the family business in Argentina. It was clear both sides had secretly coordinated efforts to ensure their children would never see each other again. Elena received the news from her younger sister, who had overheard a conversation between their parents by chance. Her heart sank as she realized she had less than a week before being exiled. That night, taking advantage of a moment when her guards were distracted, she managed to escape and ran to the place where she and Mateo used to meet, hoping he might have had the same idea. The abandoned mill on the outskirts of town had become their secret refuge, the only place where they could be themselves without fear of being discovered. Mateo was already there when Elena arrived, and the two embraced with the desperation of lovers who feared this might be their last chance. Their eyes reflected days of forced separation, pain and frustration, but also a fierce determination that surprised even them. "I won't let them tear us apart," Mateo whispered into her hair, holding her tightly as she trembled in his arms. "We'll find a way to be together, even if it means leaving everything behind." Elena nodded, knowing that any plan they came up with would be risky, but also that the alternative was a life filled with regret and longing. They spent hours discussing strategies, from running away together to trying to find mediators who could help reconcile the families. But each option seemed riddled with impossible obstacles, and time was slipping away. In the end, they decided their only option was to confront both families directly. They would risk public humiliation in the hope that love could triumph over generations of hatred. Their plan was bold and desperate. Elena and Mateo would present themselves together at the weekly Sunday gathering held at the Mendoza estate, knowing that some Vasquez relatives would likely be present due to inevitable business ties. Their intention was to make a public declaration of their love, explain how they met and fell for each other, and plead with their families to consider letting go of the past for the sake of the future. Elena spent the night rehearsing her speech, while Mateo searched for the right words to prove that their love was not a betrayal, but a chance to heal old wounds. Both knew they were putting everything on the line, but living apart was no longer truly living. Sunday arrived with an atmosphere thick with tension. Elena had convinced her younger sister to help her slip away from her family's watchful eyes, while Mateo seized the opportunity to leave his house unnoticed during breakfast. They met in the garden of the Mendoza estate, where the family gathering was already underway. They could hear the voices of guests and relatives congregating in the main courtyard, including some they recognized from the Vasquez side. It was now or never. Hand in hand, they walked toward the place where their fates would be decided. Elena could feel her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it, while Mateo gripped her hand like an anchor in the storm. They both knew that the next few minutes would define the rest of their lives, and that there was no turning back. The patio doors opened before them like a gateway into the unknown, and together, they took the step that would change everything forever. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The moment Elena and Mateo appeared hand in hand in the courtyard, all conversation ceased abruptly. The faces of those present displayed the full spectrum of emotions: shock, anger, disappointment, curiosity, and, in some, a quiet understanding that suggested not everyone completely disapproved of what was happening. Don Fernando stood up so quickly that his chair toppled over, while Don Ricardo froze like a marble statue, his eyes filled with a silent fury. The women of both families began to whisper among themselves, some with horror, others with barely concealed intrigue. Elena and Mateo's siblings and cousins exchanged confused glances, unsure how to respond to a moment so far outside the bounds of family tradition. Time seemed to stop, as if even the universe was holding its breath, watching this act of defiance that could alter the course of two families forever. Elena was the first to find her voice amid the stunned silence that had descended on the patio. Head held high, her hand still firmly intertwined with Mateo's, she began to speak with a clarity and conviction that surprised even those who knew her best. "Papa, Mama, family, I know what I'm about to say will hurt you, but I can't go on living a lie. I love Mateo Vasquez, and he loves me. Our love wasn't born from betrayal or a desire to hurt our families. It came from a chance encounter that allowed us to see each other as people, not as predetermined enemies. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words were strong and resolute. For months we've tried to reconcile our feelings with our family loyalties, but we've realized it's impossible to live denying what we feel. We're not asking you to forget decades of disagreements overnight. We're just begging you to consider that maybe, just maybe, love can be stronger than hate. She looked straight into her father's eyes, searching for even a flicker of understanding behind his hardened gaze. When she finished, Mateo stepped forward. His voice carried a maturity few had ever seen in him before. Don Fernando, Don Ricardo, members of both families, I take full responsibility for having kept my relationship with Elena a secret. But it was never out of cowardice or disrespect. I simply needed time to understand the depth of my feelings and figure out the right way to approach this. Elena is extraordinary, intelligent, kind, and courageous. She's taught me that a person's worth isn't defined by their last name, but by their actions and character. If you give me the chance, I promise to prove that my love for her is not a threat to your traditions, but an opportunity to build something new and beautiful. His words were respectful, measured, but also firm in their conviction. I'm willing to make any sacrifice to earn your trust and respect, but I will not sacrifice my love for Elena. Don Fernando's response was as violent as everyone had feared. He stormed toward his daughter, his face red with rage and public humiliation. How dare you bring this enemy into our home? How dare you defile our house with your betrayal? His voice roared, causing several guests to instinctively step back. I've given you everything since the day you were born. I've protected you, educated you, loved you, and this is how you repay me? By shaming me in front of our entire family, in front of all our friends. Elena did not step back, even as tears streamed down her cheeks. Papa, I never wanted to hurt you. I love our family. I love all of you. But I also love Mateo. Why must I choose between two loves that should be able to coexist? Her question hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed Don Fernando might falter. But then his expression hardened even more, and he turned toward Mateo with clearly hostile intent. Before the situation could escalate into physical violence, Don Ricardo intervened. He approached Mateo with deliberate steps. Though his face was etched with deep disappointment, his voice remained controlled. Mateo, you are my son and you will always be my son. But today you've dishonored our name in a way I may never be able to forgive. Vasquez men do not conspire with enemies, much less fall in love with them. If you truly love this girl as you say, you should have come to me like a man, not hidden for months like a coward. Mateo tried to speak, but his father raised a hand to silence him. I've said all I need to say. You have two choices: give up this obsession and behave like the son I raised, or leave this house and never return. There is no middle ground. The ultimatum fell like a hammer on Mateo's heart, and he realized his father would not budge, not even an inch. But then, something unexpected happened. A frail but firm voice rose from the back of the patio. It was Dona Esperanza, Elena's grandmother and the most respected matriarch of the Mendoza family. At 90 years old, she had witnessed more family conflicts than she could count, and her words carried a weight that even Don Fernando dared not challenge. Fernando, Ricardo, stop this right now. This has gone too far. Her voice was soft but commanding, and everyone turned to her in surprise. I've lived long enough to see the damage hate can do, and I've lived long enough to recognize true love when I see it. These young people are not our enemies. They are victims of a feud that has poisoned our families for far too many years. She slowly approached Elena and Mateo, leaning on her cane, her wise eyes shining with decades of hard-earned insight. Maybe it's time we consider the possibility that a terrible mistake was made long ago. Dona Esperanza's words struck like lightning in the middle of an emotional storm. Her intervention didn't just shock everyone. It created a much-needed pause in the rising hostility that threatened to destroy any chance of reconciliation. She walked slowly but firmly toward Elena and Mateo, and when she reached them, She looked deep into their eyes with an intensity that seemed to pierce their souls. "Young ones, look me in the eyes," she said softly but firmly. "Tell me, here and now, in front of everyone, is what you feel for each other real? Or are you just chasing the thrill of the forbidden?" Elena and Mateo exchanged a glance, then turned to face her. Their gaze held a sincerity that could not be faked. "Dona Esperanza," Elena said, voice trembling but steady, "what I feel for Mateo goes beyond rebellion or impulse. It's a love that has changed me, made me more compassionate, more courageous. I can't imagine my life without him." Mateo nodded and added, "Ma'am, I deeply respect your wisdom. I swear on everything sacred to me, my love for Elena is not a fleeting adventure or defiance. It is the purest and deepest feeling I've ever known. She has shown me that true love knows no artificial boundaries, and I'm willing to fight for it until my last breath." The old woman studied them for a few seconds more, as if reading their hearts. Then she slowly nodded. "Very well. Now I want everyone to sit and listen to what I have to say. It's time you learned the real story behind the feud that has divided our families for so many years." A murmur swept through the crowd. Very few people knew the real origins of the Mendoza-Vasquez conflict. Even Don Fernando and Don Ricardo exchanged surprised looks, realizing the matriarch knew more than they had ever imagined. Dona Esperanza sat down in a chair someone quickly brought her and began to speak. "Over 60 years ago, when I was a young wife and mother, our families were not enemies. In fact, we were business partners and close friends. Your grandfather, Fernando, and Ricardo's grandfather worked together on various ventures. Our families gathered often for celebrations and special occasions. But everything changed due to a terrible misunderstanding involving my late husband and Don Ricardo's father." Her voice grew heavier with memory. "There was a land deal both men wanted. One of them secured it, and the other felt betrayed. But the truth is, there was never any real betrayal, just a string of miscommunications that escalated." Elena and Mateo looked at each other with a mix of hope and disbelief, slowly realizing their love might be the key to healing a wound that should never have existed. "Pride," she continued, "is a poison that passes down through generations if left unchecked. The men in our families were too proud to admit their mistakes, too stubborn to take the first step toward reconciliation. Over time, the misunderstanding became resentment, the resentment became hatred, and that hatred turned into a tradition we passed down like a family heirloom." Her words echoed through the silence, and many present exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing they had inherited a grudge based on nothing but error and ego. "I kept this truth hidden for decades, waiting for the right moment. But watching these young people willing to sacrifice everything for love, I know the time has come. We cannot let another generation suffer for the mistakes of the past." Don Fernando and Don Ricardo were visibly shaken by the revelation. For the first time in years, they looked at each other without the mask of hatred they had worn for so long. The silence that followed Dona Esperanza's revelation was no longer tense and hostile, it was full of reflection and possibility. Don Ricardo was the first to speak, turning to Don Fernando in a voice that had lost much of its former harshness. "If what Dona Esperanza says is true, then we've wasted decades of our lives nurturing a hatred that never should have existed. Our children have grown up believing they were enemies, when they should have been friends." Don Fernando nodded slowly, his face still pale with the shock of truth. "Ricardo, I don't even know how to begin processing this. For so many years, I taught my children to fear your family, to see you as the enemy. But if my mother speaks the truth, then I've been wrong all this time." The two men stared at each other for several seconds, as if seeing one another for the first time in decades. Slowly, Don Ricardo extended his hand to Don Fernando. "Maybe it's time we let our children teach us about forgiveness." Elena and Mateo watched with bated breath as their fathers shook hands for the first time in their lives. It was a historic moment, not just for them, but for both families. But they knew reconciliation wouldn't be easy. It would take time, effort, and the willingness to break down walls built over generations. "Papa," Elena asked, voice trembling, Does this mean Mateo and I can be together? Don Fernando looked at his daughter for a long time before replying. My daughter, I won't lie. This will be hard, for me, for all of us. But if what I feel for your mother after 30 years of marriage is love, then I recognize that same feeling in your eyes when you look at this young man. I have no right to deny you happiness based on a lie. Elena ran into his arms, crying with relief. Don Ricardo approached his son with slow but resolute steps. Mateo, I must admit, your courage today has impressed me. While I don't agree with how you kept your relationship secret, I respect your determination to fight for what you love. If you truly love this woman, then you have my blessing to court her properly. Tears filled Mateo's eyes as he stepped forward to embrace his father. I promise you'll never regret this decision. I'll do everything I can to be worthy of Elena, and to honor both our families. Their embrace was emotional and healing, the beginning of a new era for the Vasquez family. But the real test would come in the days and months ahead, as both families worked together to rebuild trust and rewrite their legacy. The following months were a slow period of adjustment. Elena and Mateo were finally able to live their love openly, though still under the careful eyes of their families. Joint meetings were held between the Mendozas and Vasquez, initially tense, but gradually more relaxed. Family businesses began collaborating on small projects, testing the waters for a future partnership. There were arguments, misunderstandings, and setbacks, but the desire to heal was real. Elena and Mateo became unofficial ambassadors of reconciliation, building bridges where before there were walls. A year after that unforgettable Sunday, Elena and Mateo were married in a ceremony that united not just two hearts, but two families that had rediscovered the meaning of unity and forgiveness. Dona Esperanza, beaming in the front row, served as the matron of honor, recognized by all as the wise woman whose courage had made it all possible. In her speech at the reception, she declared, "True love not only unites two hearts, it heals wounds once thought incurable." Elena and Mateo have taught us that sometimes, the greatest enemies are the ones we create in our own minds. The Mendoza and Vasquez families, now joined in marriage and strengthened by truth, began a new tradition of shared celebrations and mutual support. Their businesses flourished under their newfound alliance, and the next generation grew up knowing only friendship where once there had been division. Elena and Mateo went on to found an organization that helped families in conflict find their path to healing, turning their own love story into a legacy of hope for generations to come. Their love didn't just conquer hatred, it transformed it into a force for good, proving that the most beautiful stories are often born from the most painful struggles.